So you've been covering the Greens, in particular today, and looking at this really quite explosive, for Keir Starmer anyway, quote that he gave about Polanski and whether the Green Party is a threat to Labour or is a threat to the country. What is it exactly that he said?
Yes, so this was in a punchy interview with The Observer where he said of the Greens, they're anti-NATO at a time when the world's more volatile than ever. They want to legalise drugs, so they think it would be all right to sell drugs outside my kid's school. But ban landlords, they're nuts, they're dangerous.
Yeah, that is pretty punchy language for him anyway, right?
Yeah, and it's part of a pattern. So Steve Reed on this podcast said they're wacky.
I love the word wacky, it's so 90s.
Rachel Reeves in her budget said, the only things that would get bigger under Zack Polanski, alluding to his hypnotherapist past, were inflation and the deficit. And it's not a surprise you're seeing more attacks because, as I've often pointed out, the Greens are now winning more of Labour's 2024 voters than any other party, about 20% of them. It's far ahead of Reform, who are on 12, and the Lib Dems, who are on 11. In some polls, they've overtaken Labour, so they're a real threat. But I think the line of attack that Starmer adopted risks backfiring, because nothing in that attack really speaks to people who are disillusioned with Labour and who've moved to the Greens or maybe thinking about it. It's true that the Greens' anti-NATO policy and their policy on drugs are both pretty unpopular with the general public. But what I think Starmer needs to do is convince progressives, and most people who lean towards the Greens are progressive, that Labour's actually the natural home for them, and to question whether the Greens are really as progressive as they sometimes make out.
I want to come back and talk about the polling in a little bit, because I think it's really fascinating and it's sort of key to understanding what's going on within the Labour government at the moment. But since you are in the position of offering communications advice to Labour, which you so often do on this podcast, we hope that all of the comms are listening in, and the ministers too, of course. If you don't think that highlighting to unpopular policies, NATO and drug legalisation is the way for Labour to target the Greens, what should they be doing instead? And is anyone in Labour doing what you think would be more successful?
Well, I think as one government source put it to me, you need a values-led argument. So even on NATO, for instance, don't just say they're anti-NATO, say that they would abandon Zelensky and Ukraine to Putin's Russia. So you immediately frame Polanski as on the side of someone who progressives dislike, Vladimir Putin. And then I think you need to say, look, if you're sympathetic to green causes, we've been the greenest government ever. We've got Ed Miliband as climate secretary. We're championing net zero. You can point to economic policy as well. The renters' rights bill, we know that housing's driven a lot of support for the Greens. You've got wealth taxes to point to, and actually, in fairness, Rachel Reeves did in her budget, saying that we've raised taxes on private schools, private jets, private equity.
That was a good line, I thought.
Yeah, I think it was
better than the hypnotherapist line, right?
There has been frustration in the Treasury about the lack of cut through that some of Labour's wealth taxes have got. To which others in the party point out, well, you need to talk about them more inventively. And I think that was a strong line for that audience. And then there's foreign policy as well. I mean, Labour recently recognised a Palestinian state. They banned 30 arms licenses to Israel. It's not as if there aren't concrete policies that you can point to about the kind of issues that might concern those moving to the Greens. And look, finally, of course, in terms of how you frame this, you say, look, a divided progressive vote ends up with Nigel Farage in number 10. He's an increasingly unpopular figure at the moment. So in a single breath, you've put Polanski as on the side of Putin and on the side of Farage. I think that's more likely to give left-leaning voters pause for thought than saying, look, the Greens are nuts, are dangerous. Because if you're the kind of voter who's responsive to the nuts jibe, you're very unlikely to vote Green anyway. It's the kind of line that would resonate more with a conservative or reform-leaning voter.
Well, on meeting the Greens where they are, as it were, we did have a sort of example of that. So Zack Polanski also makes punchy comments, shall we say, and he was on Question Time last week and said something quite, even if you sympathise with his point, something quite provocative on social care. And then Wes Streeting came out and did pretty much exactly what you're advising and talked about Labour's plan on social care and on increasing minimum wage and making it a profession where people were skilled and have career progression and want to work in. What did you make of that?
Well, I thought that was a strong blow on Polanski, and one of the strongest we've seen, because it questioned the Greens' progressive credentials and their class politics. It's basically saying, I don't think it's right for him to just say, look, I don't want to wipe someone's bum, and social care is actually a valued profession. So there, again, your Labour is putting itself on the side of progressives who might not have liked Polanski's comments, and saying that actually we're the party that's going to stand up for workers. That's a card Labour really can play against the Greens, because although some trade unions, Unite most obviously, are sort of speculating about disaffiliation, Labour remains the party of the unions. And again, I think playing that sort of class card against the Greens, that your middle class protesters who don't really understand the real challenges that ordinary working people face. Again, I think that's stronger than just saying they're nuts.
Yeah, and I think it's been some Green peers in the House of Lords who have been particularly outspoken against the Workers' Rights Bill as it's been making its passage through there. So you could also, draw on that there's opposition to Labour's flagship workers' rights recognition.
Exactly. I mean, look, the reason people are drawn to the Greens is because they do see them as this cuddly progressive party. So if you can say, here's actually why they're not as progressive as America.
You're not getting your day one rights because Lord Green, probably is a Lord Green, not the actual Lord Green. The Green lords and baronesses in the House of Lords don't want you to have it. That's more powerful.
No, look, obviously it's a balancing act, because we have this with the Tories, don't they? You can't out reform. Similarly, Labour can't out Green the Greens. So but in challenging them, you don't want to then look too much like you're saying, we're exactly the same as the Greens, vote for us. Right? So you do need those dividing lines, which is why you do need to make the point on NATO, you need to make points on Trident would be another. But again, make them in a way that resonates with centre-left voters.
Well, on the polling, our polling guru, Ben Walker, has estimated that on current trends, the Greens would win 23 seats and finish a close second in 31 others. So they've definitely risen up in the rankings. I think the May elections, the local elections, were the first time that they got to 10%. And then we had 5 parties all on 10%. And obviously with the Scottish and Welsh ones, we're splitting into even more fragmentation. And we've talked before about what that does in terms of voter behaviour and tactical voting. I wonder, I've got a chart here from More in Common that just fascinated me, which was looking at voting intention by party and then looking at how different parties' voters would vote specifically to keep another party out. So if you could vote against one party in a general election, who would you vote against? Now, the headline figures are 38 would vote against Labour and 29% would vote against reform. So that's pretty damning for Keir Starmer that a plurality there would vote against Labour. But unsurprisingly, among Labour supporters, 52% would vote to get reform out or to keep reform out. Liberal Democrats, 56%. Green supporters, 62%. So there is clearly a coalition here of people who would like to vote for the Greens but feel very, very, very strongly that they don't want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister. How do you channel that if you're a Labour government?
Well, I think it's not the first argument you make, because as I said, rooting it in values and suggesting to people that Labour is your natural home, I think always works better than just a negative appeal. And that's why it is a bit of a balancing act for Labour. Talking up Farage does heighten the stakes, but you don't want to look as if you're saying, we know you're unhappy with us, but if you vote for someone else, you'll eat something even worse. Right? It's such a negative appeal for a government to be making this.
It's kind of what the Conservatives tried to do at the end of 14 years in office.
Yeah, exactly. But look, I think voters also understand the realities of the electoral system, and a lot of polling analysts now believe we've entered an era of block politics. You've got a left block and a right block, and you get voters who move around within that block. But broadly, about half of the electorate at the moment are backing left leaning parties, half the electorate are backing right-leaning ones, and the next election will be determined by which bloc is the most united. So this is partly why talk of a Reform Tory pact has come back round again. I wrote on that in Morning Call last week, and I said, in a sense, whether there's a formal pact or an informal pact is less important than whether the right is united. Because the really interesting thing in that More in Common poll is Conservative voters are now more worried about Labour winning than they are about Reform winning.
Yes.
You've got a sliver of Tory voters, perhaps Cameroon types, quite socially liberal, who see Reform very much as the enemy. But you've got others who are far more concerned about getting Labour voters out. So one way to view the election is, will the right unite to kick Labour out, or will the left unite to keep Reform out? And that means, look, of course, Labour needs to win back some of the 12% of voters it's lost to Reform. But probably the bigger challenge will be trying to unite that left bloc. And I think this is why Labour has entered, you could say, a post-Starmer mindset where people, MPs, aides are talking pretty openly about who do we think could beat Reform, because whether it's Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting, Andy Burnham, Shabana Mahmood, just to name a few of the potential
other names are available
contenders.
Ed Miliband.
The essay question is becoming who can unite the centre left against Reform. I
think that's really interesting framing, like which one gets their act together in uniting first, the left or the right. And you're absolutely right that 59% of Conservative supporters would vote against Labour, only 18% would vote against Reform. I'm fascinated by the 3% of voters in general who would love to vote against the Lib Dems. What did the Lib Dems ever do to you? Please write in and let us know. One final question though on this, on kind of voter behaviour and on treating your voters with respect. You note in your column that being dismissive of parties on your fringes has risks as well. So David Cameron famously referred to UKIP supporters as fruitcakes and loonies, and we have seen a battle within the Conservative Party on Nigel Farage from his UKIP days all the way through to the Brexit Party and now Reform, on how much do you criticise the party for being racist, or how much do you criticise its supporters or suggest that its supporters might be racist, because that comes with real risks if you are essentially insulting them. We had this whole thing with the Conservative MP Kevin Hollingrake in recent weeks, suggesting that Nigel Farage's football shirt badge that you would get for supporting Reform was similar or looked similar to a Nazi badge. And it's not great if your tactic is insult the voters who are thinking about going somewhere else. So is there a risk that that's what Labour's doing here? And if you say, oh yeah, the Greens are nuts and dangerous and they really want to be able to sell heroin to your kids, the people who are considering voting Green feel a bit insulted by that.
Yes, exactly. Look, insulting the electorate is never a good idea. And you're right, look, I'm sure the point Keir Starmer would make if he was here was he was referring to the policy. He didn't call the Greens nuts as such. He was referring to their policy on legalising drugs. It was an offhand comment in an interview. But as you suggest, if you're saying to 20% of the people who voted Labour at the last election, you're now voting for a party that I consider nuts and dangerous. I mean, one response, some of them might have second thoughts on that, but others will think, well, you're insulting me now. I'm already disillusioned with your government, and you're insulting me rather than listening to my concerns. I don't think it's good or effective politics.